If you were born in a world where your people were hunted, enslaved, and your land stolen, would you surrender or would you fight? Deep in the heart of Central Africa, surrounded by vast rivers and thick forests, a girl was born who would shake the foundations of an empire. This was no ordinary girl. She was born into chaos, into a kingdom on the brink of destruction. But instead of breaking under the weight of her people's suffering, she would rise and become one of the fiercest warriors in history. Her name? Nzinga. The woman who would defy an empire. The kingdom of Ndongo, in present-day Angola, was a land of warriors, traders, and skilled diplomats. The people lived in harmony with the land, farming, hunting, and trading with their neighbors. Their king, Ngola Kilwanji Kiasamba, ruled with wisdom and strength. But far across the ocean, a new threat was rising, one that had already swallowed entire civilizations whole. The Portuguese had arrived on African shores, and they weren't here to trade fairly. By the late 16th century, the Portuguese were desperate for slaves to fuel their sugar plantations in Brazil. They raided villages, kidnapped men, women, and children, and forced them into brutal servitude. The Ndongo people, proud and free, were now being hunted like animals. But within the walls of the royal palace, a new warrior was born. Nzinga was born in 1583 under the most extraordinary circumstances. Her mother, Kanjula, was one of the king's wives, but unlike other royal births, Nzinga's arrival was anything but smooth. According to legend, she entered the world in an unusual way, with the umbilical cord wrapped around her neck. In many African traditions, this was seen as an omen, a sign that the child would either bring great misfortune or become something truly special. A traditional healer was summoned immediately. He studied the newborn, whispered to the spirits, and finally declared, "This child will either be a curse upon this kingdom or its greatest protector." As Nzinga's father listened, he remained silent, deep in thought. The Portuguese were closing in on Ndongo, attacking villages and enslaving his people. Could this child truly be the kingdom's hope? As if in response, the infant Nzinga did something no one expected. She stopped crying and looked straight at her father with piercing, unblinking eyes. The room fell silent. The elders and warriors who had gathered exchanged uneasy glances. It was as if the child already understood the weight of the world she had been born into. Nzinga, her father finally said. It was a powerful name in the Kimbundu language, meaning to twist or to turn, a name given to those destined to shape the course of history. And shape history she would. Nzinga grew up in the royal court, but she was not like the other girls. While many princesses were taught only to serve, marry, and bear children, Nzinga's father saw something different in her. She was quick-witted, sharp-tongued, and fiercely intelligent. She listened to war councils. She asked questions that made even the most seasoned warriors pause. By the time she was a teenager, she could speak Portuguese fluently, a skill that would later become one of her deadliest weapons. But Nzinga was not only a thinker, she was a fighter. While other princesses were learning courtly manners, Nzinga trained with the warriors. She learned how to wield a spear, ride a horse, and fire an arrow with deadly accuracy. She sparred with men twice her size, refusing to be seen as weak. And yet, even as she trained, she knew that brute strength alone would not be enough to save her people. If she was to defeat the Portuguese, she needed more than muscle. She needed strategy. But even as she trained and studied, the dark shadow of colonization loomed over her homeland. The Portuguese attacks were getting worse. Villages were burned. Entire families were taken. Nzinga saw it all. She heard the screams of captured children. She saw mothers wailing over their lost sons. She saw her father, once a proud and mighty king, begin to crumble under the weight of war. And in that moment, a fire was born inside her. She swore to herself, "One day I will make them pay. One day I will take back what they have stolen." What she didn't know was that day would come sooner than she expected, because soon she would face the Portuguese herself, and the world would never forget her name. The kingdom of Ndongo was no longer just a land of proud warriors and traders. It had become a battleground. The Portuguese had come, not as friends, not as merchants, but as invaders. They didn't ask for land, they took it. They didn't seek peace, they demanded submission. And as the fires of war raged across her homeland, Nzinga watched. She wasn't a queen yet. She wasn't a warrior yet. But she was ready to fight. The year was 1617. The Portuguese had been expanding their grip on Angola for decades, but now they wanted total control. They wanted Ndongo. A ruthless Portuguese governor, Luís Mendes de Vasconcelos, was sent with one mission: crush the Ndongo people and turn their land into a colony. His methods? Brutal. He ordered his soldiers to march into villages, burning homes, stealing food, and capturing entire families to be sold as slaves. The Ndongo warriors fought back, but their spears and arrows were no match for Portuguese guns and cannons. They came like a storm and left behind only ashes. Nzinga saw it all. She saw her people screaming as they were dragged away in chains. She saw warriors fighting to the last breath before being gunned down. She saw children separated from their mothers, never to see them again. But what she didn't see? Fear in her own heart. Instead, she felt something else. Anger, fire, a hunger for revenge. King Angola Kilwanji, Nzinga's father, tried to hold the kingdom together. But Ndongo was losing. The Portuguese weren't just attacking with guns. They were using something far more dangerous: division. They bribed some local chiefs to betray their own people. They spread fear, making it seem like resistance was hopeless. Even within the royal court there were whispers. Some nobles began questioning if the king could still protect them. And then the worst blow came. In 1618, after years of fighting, King Angola Kilwanji fell. Some say he died in battle. Others whisper that he was poisoned, perhaps even by those closest to him, who had lost faith in his leadership. The kingdom fell into chaos. And the Portuguese, they saw their chance. With the king dead, the throne passed to Nzinga's brother, Mbandi. But Mbandi was not a warrior. He was not a diplomat. He was terrified, and the Portuguese knew it. They tightened their grip, demanding more land, more slaves, and more power. Mbandi, desperate to save himself, made a terrible decision. He sacrificed his own people. He agreed to Portuguese demands, allowing them to take even more slaves and land in exchange for peace. But peace never came. The Portuguese were never satisfied. They only wanted more. Nzinga watched her brother bend and break. She saw him surrender to fear. And she knew if someone didn't act, Ndongo would be lost forever. Desperate for a solution, Mbandi turned to the one person who still had a chance of saving Ndongo: Nzinga. She was no queen, she was no general, but she was smarter than all of them. Mbandi sent Nzinga on a dangerous mission: to negotiate with the Portuguese governor himself. It was a suicide mission. No one expected her to succeed. But Nzinga was not just a diplomat. She was a survivor, a warrior, a strategist. And she had a plan. What happened next would go down in history, because Nzinga was about to outsmart an empire. Nzinga was no ordinary princess. She had spent her life observing, learning, and preparing for moments like this. The fate of Ndongo was now in her hands, and she was ready. In 1622, she arrived in Luanda, the capital of the Portuguese colony, to negotiate with the new governor, João Correia de Sousa. The city was unlike anything she had ever seen. Stone buildings, Portuguese soldiers patrolling the streets, and African captives being sold like cattle. Nzinga walked through the marketplace, her heart burning with rage as she saw her own people in chains. But she did not show her anger. She remained calm, poised, and unreadable. When she entered the governor's palace, she was led into a grand chamber. The Portuguese had prepared a room that made one thing clear: Nzinga was not welcome as an equal. The governor sat on an elevated chair, his advisors standing around him. The only thing prepared for Nzinga was a simple floor mat, as if she were a servant. But Nzinga had already anticipated this. Without hesitation, she motioned for one of her attendants to kneel on all fours. She gracefully sat on their back, elevating herself to the governor's level. The entire room fell silent. This was a statement. Nzinga would not be looked down upon. The governor, momentarily taken aback, continued the negotiations. The Portuguese wanted more land, more slaves, and absolute control over Ndongo. Nzinga, however, did not come to surrender. She spoke with confidence, matching their arrogance with intelligence. She reminded the governor that Ndongo was still a powerful kingdom, and that peace would benefit both sides. She offered a strategic alliance. Ndongo would accept Christianity, stop resisting Portuguese rule, and even provide captives for the slave trade. In return, the Portuguese would end their attacks and recognize Ndongo's sovereignty. The governor, impressed by Nzinga's sharp mind, agreed to a peace treaty. As part of her strategy, Nzinga agreed to be baptized, taking the Christian name Ana de Sousa Nzinga, to further solidify the agreement. She played the role of a loyal ally, knowing that this was only the beginning. Nzinga returned to Ndongo as a hero. She had done the impossible, secured a treaty that gave her people a chance to recover. But the peace would not last. The Portuguese had no intention of keeping their word. Soon they would betray Ndongo again, and this time Nzinga would not seek diplomacy. She would seek war. For a brief moment, Ndongo experienced relief. The Portuguese soldiers slowed their attacks, and for the first time in years, villages were not being burned overnight. Nzinga used this time wisely. She strengthened her army, fortified defenses, and built new alliances. But the Portuguese saw this peace as a weakness. In 1624, just 2 years after the treaty, Governor João Correa de Souza was replaced by a new governor, one who had no intention of honoring Nzinga's deal. The Portuguese wanted total control. They had no interest in sharing power. And so, without warning, they launched a brutal surprise attack on Ndongo, breaking every agreement they had signed. Nzinga's people were caught off guard. Towns were burned to the ground. Thousands were captured and sent to slave markets. This was not just an act of war, this was a betrayal, and Nzinga had been played. Nzinga, now more experienced in Portuguese deception, prepared to fight back. But before she could strike, she was betrayed from within her own court. Her brother, King Mbandi, who had once begged her to save Ndongo, now saw her as a threat. The people had more faith in Nzinga than in him. The warriors looked to her for leadership. Mbandi feared she would take his throne. And so, in an act of cowardice, he turned against his own sister. Nzinga was forced into exile, escaping with only a handful of loyal followers. For the first time, she was alone. No army, no palace, no kingdom. Only the fire in her heart. Most leaders would have accepted defeat. Most would have vanished into history, just another victim of colonization. But Nzinga was not like most leaders. She did not mourn. She did not beg. Instead, she planned. While in exile, Nzinga refused to stay idle. She traveled through enemy territory, searching for allies. She learned the land, studied Portuguese strategies, and slowly began to rebuild her power. She reached out to the Imbangala, a fierce group of warriors known for their brutality in battle. They lived by the sword, attacking villages, raiding settlements, and never bowing to anyone. Nzinga did not fear them. Instead, she did something unthinkable. She joined them. She adapted their war tactics, studied their way of life, and earned their trust. Before long, she was not just an ally, she was their leader. Nzinga had gone from a princess in exile to the commander of an unstoppable army. And now she had only one goal: revenge. The Portuguese had stolen her kingdom. Her brother had betrayed her. But Nzinga was coming back. And this time, she was bringing war. Nzinga had lost everything: her kingdom, her position, and the trust of her own family. But in exile she had found something far more powerful, an army. The Mbangala warriors were feared across the land. Unlike the Ndongo people who fought with honor, the Mbangala followed a ruthless code. They were raiders, mercenaries, and masters of guerrilla warfare. They did not build cities or settle down. They lived for battle. Nzinga, always a quick learner, did not try to change them. Instead, she adapted to their ways, proving that she was just as ruthless as they were. She fought alongside them in raids, earning their respect not as a queen, but as a warrior. She adopted their customs, their military tactics, and their unbreakable will. By the time she was ready, Nzinga was no longer just a princess in exile. She was the undisputed leader of a powerful army. By 1627, Nzinga was ready to strike back at the Portuguese. She launched a series of surprise attacks on their settlements, hitting them where they least expected. She moved swiftly, using hit-and-run tactics that confused and exhausted the enemy. She knew that her warriors could not defeat the Portuguese in direct combat, so she made sure they never had the chance to face her in open battle. Instead, she used the land to her advantage, attacking supply routes, ambushing isolated forts, and vanishing before the Portuguese could respond. With every victory, Nzinga's reputation grew. The same chiefs who had once abandoned her now sought her protection. Villages that had fallen under Portuguese control rose up in rebellion. Nzinga was no longer just fighting for herself. She was leading a full-scale war of resistance. While Nzinga was waging war, her brother Mbandi's rule crumbled. The Portuguese, never satisfied with their conquests, continued to demand more from him. They took more land, more slaves, and stripped him of any real power. The people lost faith in him. They whispered Nzinga's name in the streets, hoping she would return. Mbandi, paranoid and desperate, feared that Nzinga's growing influence would cost him his throne. But he would not have to worry for long. In 1626, Mbandi died under mysterious circumstances. Some say it was illness. Others believe Nzinga had him poisoned. Whatever the truth, Nzinga seized the moment. She returned to Ndongo not as an exile, but as its rightful ruler. The chiefs who had once doubted her now swore loyalty to her. The warriors of Ndongo, inspired by her victories, rallied to her side. Nzinga, once a princess without a kingdom, was now Queen of Ndongo. But her fight was far from over. The Portuguese would not accept her rule, and Nzinga would never bow to them. The real war was about to begin. Nzinga was now the rightful queen of Ndongo, but she knew that wearing the crown was only the beginning. The Portuguese would never allow her to rule in peace. They wanted full control of Ndongo, and to them, Nzinga was nothing more than a rebel standing in their way. But she was not just any rebel. She was a strategist, a warrior, and a leader who had learned the art of survival. Nzinga knew that she could not defeat the Portuguese in a traditional war. Their weapons, numbers, and European battle formations gave them the upper hand in open combat. So instead she turned to guerrilla warfare, using tactics that the Portuguese had never encountered before. Her warriors struck at night, moving through the dense forests undetected. They set traps, poisoned water sources, and ambushed Portuguese caravans carrying weapons and supplies. They used the land to their advantage, attacking Portuguese settlements, freeing captives, and disappearing before reinforcements could arrive. Nzinga's forces were unpredictable, fighting on their own terms, and never allowing the Portuguese to dictate the battlefield. The Portuguese were frustrated. They had underestimated Nzinga, thinking that she would surrender once Mbandi was gone. Instead, she had grown stronger. Nzinga understood that fighting alone would not be enough. She needed allies, powerful ones. In 1641, she formed an alliance with the Dutch, who had taken control of Luanda from the Portuguese. The Dutch, eager to weaken Portugal's hold on Africa, agreed to support Nzinga's resistance. She supplied them with warriors and intelligence, while they provided her with guns, ammunition, and military support. With the Dutch on her side, Nzinga launched an even bolder campaign against the Portuguese. She reclaimed lost territories, attacked Portuguese-held forts, and proved that Ndongo would not be conquered so easily. Her growing success inspired others to join her cause. Former captives, escaped slaves, and even defecting warriors from Portuguese ranks rallied under Nzinga's leadership. She had not only built an army, she had built a movement. Unlike other rulers of her time, Nzinga refused to be limited by tradition. She knew that to survive, she had to think differently. She trained women as warriors, breaking centuries-old customs that kept women off the battlefield. These women fought alongside men, striking fear into the Portuguese ranks. She also adopted psychological warfare, spreading rumors, creating confusion among the enemy, and using deception to lure the Portuguese into traps. Nzinga, dressed like a warrior, rode into battle herself and ensured that her soldiers saw her fighting alongside them. She did not rule from behind palace walls, she ruled from the battlefield. Despite her victories, Nzinga knew that the war was far from over. The Portuguese were relentless. They kept sending reinforcements, bribing local chiefs, and trying to divide her people. But Nzinga never wavered. She continued to fight, moving between the forests of Ndongo and the stronghold she had built in Matamba. She had transformed Matamba into a fortress of resistance, a place where warriors were trained, captives were freed, and strategies were devised. She was not just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the future of her people, and as long as she drew breath, she would never surrender. Nzinga had spent years fighting, but she had not lost her resolve. Every battle, every betrayal, and every hardship had only made her stronger. The Portuguese had thrown everything they had at her, yet she refused to fall. By now, she was no longer just a queen, she was a legend. Her people saw her as a symbol of resilience, someone who would never bow to foreign rule. Even those who had once doubted her leadership now followed her without question. But the war was taking its toll. Years of fighting had drained her resources. The Portuguese, despite their losses, continued to send reinforcements. The Dutch, who had once been her allies, began to shift their focus elsewhere, reducing their support. Nzinga knew that if she wanted to keep resisting, she needed a new strategy. Nzinga had already established Matamba as her new base of power. Now she focused on turning it into an economic and military stronghold. She welcomed fleeing warriors, freed slaves, and defectors from Portuguese ranks, incorporating them into her army. She made Matamba a safe haven for anyone who opposed Portuguese rule. To strengthen her position, Nzinga established trade routes, dealing with neighboring kingdoms and European merchants who were willing to trade with her. She used this trade to fund her military campaigns, ensuring that her army never ran out of supplies. She also negotiated with other African leaders, forming alliances that would help her continue the fight. Even as war raged on, Nzinga was not just thinking about the present, she was planning for the future. Nzinga knew that warfare alone would not be enough to drive out the Portuguese. She needed to outmaneuver them politically. She used every tool at her disposal: bribery, deception, and negotiation. She would pretend to accept Portuguese demands, only to break agreements when it suited her. She played her enemies against one another, ensuring that no one could completely dominate her kingdom. At times, she would send false messages, tricking the Portuguese into thinking she was retreating, only to launch a surprise attack when they let their guard down. She mastered the art of survival, proving that power was not just about strength, it was about strategy. Despite their superior firepower, the Portuguese failed to capture Nzinga. Her guerrilla tactics kept them on edge. They could never predict where she would strike next. Every time they thought they had cornered her, she would escape, regroup, and attack again. They underestimated her ability to adapt, and this cost them dearly. Even when they occupied parts of her land, they could never fully control it. Nzinga's forces continued to resist, making it impossible for the Portuguese to claim total victory. She had turned a war for survival into a war for liberation. Nzinga had spent decades fighting, and still she remained unbroken. She had proven that she was not just a warrior, she was a force of nature. Nzinga had spent years resisting the Portuguese, but she was more than just a warrior. She was a ruler. While Ndongo remained a battleground, she focused on transforming Matamba into a powerful and independent kingdom. Matamba was once a secondary kingdom, overshadowed by Ndongo and other regional powers, but under Nzinga's leadership it became a center of military strength, political strategy, and economic growth. She ruled Matamba with discipline and vision, shaping it into a kingdom that could sustain her resistance for years to come. Nzinga knew that Matamba's survival depended on its ability to defend itself. She continued to train her warriors in guerrilla warfare, ensuring that they were always prepared for sudden attacks. She also encouraged women to serve in the army, breaking the traditional belief that warfare was only for men. Nzinga's female warriors fought with the same intensity as their male counterparts, proving that loyalty and strength mattered more than gender. Nzinga herself remained active in battle, leading by example. She ensured that her army was highly disciplined, well-equipped, and fiercely loyal. Her forces became one of the most feared military units in the region. Nzinga understood that war required resources and Matamba needed to be self-sustaining. She established trade relations with the Dutch, regional African kingdoms, and European merchants, ensuring a steady flow of goods, weapons, and supplies. Matamba became a key player in regional commerce, controlling important trade routes that connected the interior of Africa to coastal markets. She also ensured that her people could sustain themselves through farming and local industries, reducing reliance on external support. Under Nzinga's rule, Matamba was no longer just a place of refuge. It was a thriving kingdom with economic and political influence. Matamba was more than Nzinga's stronghold. It became a symbol of African resistance against colonial rule. Escaped slaves, displaced warriors, and those seeking freedom flocked to Matamba, knowing that it was one of the few places where they could live without Portuguese oppression. Nzinga welcomed them all, incorporating many of them into her growing army. She also established a structured government, ensuring that Matamba remained stable even in times of war. Her leadership ensured that the kingdom could continue resisting Portuguese expansion, even as European forces gained more control over neighboring territories. Matamba had once been overlooked. Now, under Nzinga's rule, it was one of the strongest and most respected kingdoms in Central Africa. Nzinga had always understood that winning a war was not just about strength, it was about strategy and alliances. She knew that fighting the Portuguese alone would be difficult, so she looked for partners who could help weaken their power. By the early 1640s, she found the perfect opportunity. The Dutch had taken control of Luanda from the Portuguese and were looking for allies to help expand their influence in Angola. Nzinga saw this as her chance to form an alliance that could shift the balance of power in her favor. Nzinga sent envoys to meet with Dutch officials in Luanda, offering them a military alliance against the Portuguese. She promised to support Dutch forces with warriors and supplies in exchange for weapons, ammunition, and strategic support in her war against Portugal. The Dutch, eager to strengthen their hold on Angola, agreed to the deal. This partnership gave Nzinga access to European firearms and artillery, giving her warriors a better chance against Portuguese forces. For the first time, Nzinga had a European ally fighting on her side. With Dutch support, Nzinga launched a new series of attacks against Portuguese-held territories. Her forces coordinated with Dutch troops, targeting Portuguese fortresses and supply routes. One of the most significant battles occurred in 1644, when Nzinga's warriors, alongside Dutch forces, defeated a large Portuguese army in Angola. This victory further weakened Portugal's control in the region and proved that Nzinga was still a major threat. Her reputation as a fearless and strategic leader grew even stronger. But alliances in war were always unstable. By 1648, the Portuguese had regained strength and launched a massive counterattack to retake Luanda from the Dutch. The Dutch, unable to hold their position, were forced to retreat from Angola, leaving Nzinga without a European ally. The Portuguese once again became the dominant colonial force in the region. Nzinga, now without Dutch support, had to rely solely on her own warriors and resources. But even without foreign allies, Nzinga refused to surrender. She continued to resist, proving that her fight was never dependent on outsiders. Nzinga's war against the Portuguese was far from over. She was prepared to keep fighting, no matter the odds. With the Dutch gone, Nzinga was once again standing alone against the Portuguese, but she had fought too long and too hard to give up now. She had built Matamba into a strong kingdom, raised an army that was feared across the region, and shown that she was a leader who would never surrender. The Portuguese, determined to crush her once and for all, launched another full-scale offensive against Nzinga's forces. Their goal was simple: destroy Matamba and end Nzinga's resistance forever. But Nzinga had no intention of letting that happen. For years, Nzinga had mastered guerrilla warfare, attacking Portuguese settlements, ambushing soldiers, and cutting off supply routes. She continued to use these tactics, ensuring that the Portuguese could never hold onto any land they captured. Even when they managed to push into Matamba's borders, Nzinga's warriors would strike back, forcing them to retreat. The war dragged on for years, with neither side willing to surrender. Nzinga knew that this was not just a war for her throne. It was a war for the survival of her people. Despite their superior weapons and numbers, the Portuguese found Nzinga's forces impossible to defeat completely. Her warriors were mobile, unpredictable, and knew the terrain better than any foreign army ever could. Nzinga continued to inspire her people, reminding them that freedom was worth any sacrifice. She personally led troops into battle, making it clear that she would rather die fighting than live under Portuguese rule. Even as she aged, Nzinga showed no signs of weakness. She remained the driving force of Matamba's resistance. After decades of fighting, Nzinga realized that she needed to secure Matamba's future in a different way. She began negotiating peace with the Portuguese, not out of weakness, but out of strategy. She knew that if she could establish an agreement that protected Matamba's independence, she would have won the war without ever surrendering. Using her diplomatic skills, Nzinga worked toward a political solution that would allow her people to live free while avoiding further destruction. After years of battle, she had proven that Matamba could never be fully conquered. Nzinga was not just a warrior, she was a survivor. Her fight was almost over, but her legacy was just beginning. Nzinga was known as a fierce warrior and a brilliant strategist, but she was also a ruler who broke traditions and shaped a kingdom that reflected her vision. Unlike most African queens of her time, Nzinga never married in the traditional sense. Instead, she built a personal guard of young male warriors, some of whom she took as consorts. She ruled without a king, proving that she needed no man to secure her power. Her leadership was firm but fair. She rewarded loyalty and punished betrayal swiftly. She demanded absolute discipline from her warriors, and in return, she gave them a leader they could trust, one who fought beside them, not from behind palace walls. Even in her personal life, Nzinga remained a symbol of resistance and independence. Nzinga's reign in Matamba was not just about war. She also worked to strengthen her kingdom politically and economically. She encouraged trade with European merchants, ensuring that Matamba had a strong economy despite being in a constant state of war. She also welcomed refugees, enslaved people who had escaped from Portuguese captivity, and African warriors who had lost their own kingdoms. She turned Matamba into a sanctuary for the oppressed, a place where people could rebuild their lives under her protection. Nzinga also played a key role in spreading Christianity throughout her kingdom, but she practiced it on her own terms. While she had been baptized as Ana de Souza Nzinga, she never fully abandoned her traditional African beliefs. Instead, she merged the two, ensuring that her people could embrace new ideas while staying true to their culture. By the late 1650s, Nzinga had been ruling Matamba for more than 3 decades. She had spent her entire life fighting, and although she had secured peace with the Portuguese, she remained vigilant. Even in her older years, she continued to train soldiers, manage political affairs, and prepare Matamba for the future. Her resilience kept Matamba strong, and her presence alone ensured that the Portuguese never attempted to fully conquer her lands. Nzinga knew that her time was nearing its end, but she had already won a victory that no one could take away. She had kept her people free. Her name had become a symbol of strength, intelligence, and defiance. She was more than just a queen, she was a legend. Nzinga had ruled Matamba for over 3 decades, but she never let her guard down. Even after negotiating peace with the Portuguese, she remained prepared for war, knowing that her enemies could never be trusted. Despite her age, she continued to train soldiers, oversee military strategies, and personally lead her people. She was in her 60s now, but her spirit was just as strong as when she first took up arms against the Portuguese. She rebuilt Matamba's defenses, ensuring that the kingdom could survive even after she was gone. She appointed trusted commanders to lead her forces and trained younger leaders in the art of war and diplomacy. She had spent her entire life fighting, and she knew that Matamba's survival depended on continuing her legacy of resistance. Even after the peace treaty, Nzinga kept a close watch on Portuguese activities in the region. She knew that their desire for power had not disappeared, and she suspected that they would attempt to take control of Matamba once she was no longer around to resist them. To counter this, she focused on strengthening alliances with neighboring kingdoms, maintaining Matamba's military readiness, and keeping trade routes secure. In her final years, she launched one last campaign to drive out remaining Portuguese forces from regions that still suffered under colonial rule. Though the battles were smaller than in previous years, they were just as significant. Nzinga was not just protecting her kingdom, she was fighting for the future of African sovereignty. Her final battles were a statement to the world: Matamba would never fall as long as she lived. Nzinga passed away in 1663 at the age of 80. Her death marked the end of an era, but her legacy continued long after she was gone. Under her rule, Matamba remained independent, resisting Portuguese control for years after her passing. Nzinga's leadership had built a foundation for future resistance movements, inspiring other African leaders to fight against European colonization. She had proven that African kingdoms could not only resist foreign invasion, but also thrive under strong leadership. Even in death, Nzinga's name lived on as a symbol of defiance, strength, and resilience. She had started as a young princess fighting for survival. She ended as one of the greatest warrior queens in history. Nzinga's passing in 1663 marked the end of one of the most extraordinary reigns in African history. She had fought for over 4 decades, resisting one of the most powerful colonial forces of her time. Her death was not just the loss of a queen, it was the loss of a symbol of resistance. Though she had spent much of her life in battle, she did not die on the battlefield. Instead, she passed away peacefully in Matamba, an old but unbroken warrior. Her death left a void in the kingdom, as her people had come to see her as the heart and soul of their independence. She had outlived many of her enemies, defied European powers, and rewritten the history of her people. Even in her final moments, she remained a queen who had never bowed to foreign rule. Even after her death, Nzinga's influence did not fade. She had built Matamba into a strong, independent kingdom, ensuring that her people would not be easily conquered. She left behind a system of governance, military strategies, and trade alliances that allowed Matamba to remain a powerful force for years. Her successors carried on her legacy of resistance, continuing to push back against Portuguese influence in the region. Her leadership had ensured that Matamba remained a free kingdom, resisting full Portuguese control for more than a century after her death. Nzinga's name became legendary not just in Matamba but across Africa and beyond. Stories of her bravery, intelligence, and unyielding spirit were passed down through generations. She became a symbol of African resistance, inspiring later independence movements against European colonial rule. Her legacy extended beyond politics and war. She changed the perception of African women in leadership, proving that they could be warriors, strategists, and rulers without needing to rely on men. Nzinga was not just a queen, she was an icon, a revolutionary, and one of history's greatest leaders. Nzinga's story did not end with her death. Her legacy continued to shape African history, inspiring resistance movements, leaders, and cultural narratives for centuries. She was more than just a queen. She became a symbol of defiance, resilience, and leadership. Her fight against Portuguese colonization set an example for future African rulers who refused to be conquered. Many leaders looked to Nzinga's tactics, her use of diplomacy, guerrilla warfare, and alliances, as a blueprint for resisting European imperialism. Her ability to navigate the complexities of war and politics made her one of the most respected figures in African history. At a time when women were often excluded from political and military power, she rose to command armies, negotiate with European rulers, and build an empire. She proved that leadership is not defined by gender, but by strength, intelligence, and determination. Today, Nzinga is recognized not just as an African leader, but as one of the greatest female rulers in world history. Her name continues to inspire women who challenge oppression, fight for equality, and lead with courage. Queen Nzinga's story is not just a tale from the past. It is a powerful lesson for the present and the future. She showed the world that true leadership is not given, it is earned. She was a warrior, a strategist, and a ruler who refused to be defined by limitations. Her life teaches us that resistance is possible even against the strongest forces. She did not just fight battles with swords and spears. She fought with intelligence, diplomacy, and an unbreakable will. Nzinga's legacy reminds us that courage, resilience, and determination can change the course of history. She was not just a queen, she was a symbol of African resistance, female empowerment, and fearless leadership. Her story lives on, inspiring new generations to stand up against oppression, fight for justice, and believe in their own power. If you enjoyed the story of Queen Nzinga, there are many more incredible tales of legendary figures waiting for you. Subscribe to the Stories of Legends YouTube channel. Discover powerful stories of warriors, kings, queens, and revolutionaries who shaped history. Stay tuned for more inspiring and untold legends from across the world. Hit the subscribe button now and join the journey through history. Don't just read history, experience it. Subscribe to Stories of Legends today